Welcome to Living the Smarter Science of Slim, where we provide a scientifically proven lifestyle for long-term health and fat loss by eating more and exercising less, but smarter.
Eat smarter, exercise smarter, live better. I am so ready for that.
Hey everyone, Jonathan Bailor back with another bonus Smarter Science of Slim podcast. Very excited about today's show. We have a fellow Buckeye with us. He is a professor of psychology, neuroscience, and molecular virology, immunology, and medical genetics at the Ohio State University, Buckeyes, and Medical Center. He is the author of Your Brain on Food, and he is also the author of a wildly popular Psychology Today blog. Professor Gary Wenk, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. Thanks for the invitation to be here. I look forward to it.
Gary, you are known for very, very profound work on the impact that chemicals have on our brain. And certainly people interested in food have then gotten into the mix because they say, well, food is like chemicals. It must have an impact on the brain. Can you tell us a bit about your work just from a macro perspective?
Well, sure. I got into studying the effects of nutrients on the brain when I was a graduate student, so many years ago. And essentially, I began by looking at things like metals that people were consuming. And I've noticed that they had some profound effects on brain function, brain chemistry. And so I've been really, since that time, continuing with that line of research. My research today is an investigation of brain aging. And I've been trying to find ways to either reverse it, slow it down, or at least have some impact that gives people a longer sort of better quality of life into their 50s, 60s, and 70s. And that's why I've been focusing so much on using nutrients and treating them as chemicals and trying to find some way to slow the aging process.
Well, Gary, I want to cover two things in the remainder of our time together because there's so much we could cover. One is actually what you found in terms of how we can slow down brain age. But before we get there, I wanted to have you on the show because I think you, maybe more than anyone else, can speak to what I perceive as a false dichotomy between drugs and food. It seems there may be more similarity there than most people think.
Absolutely. And I like to make analogies between things that people are very familiar with. And, I've been teaching a drugs in the brain course to undergraduates here at, OSU and at other universities where I've worked. And it helps to point that out, but you've got to sneak up on that realization. You just can't tell somebody they can become addicted to sugar using the exact same brain pathways that they might become addicted to heroin. It's like, oh my God, that can't be true. But when you sort of sneak around the corner on that logic and you point out to them, well, let's look at how the things that you're eating are affecting how you feel. And that leads to sort of a bigger understanding that food affects how my brain works, as any other chemical would, in three different ways. First, food tends to have very abrupt changes on how you're thinking and feeling. For example, coffee, for many people, is considered a food. For others, it's a drug. It's a chemical, though. And I like to have my students view themselves as a big bag of chemicals. And it's like a soup. And you throw in a dash of salt, you throw in a dash of pepper, you throw in a dash of caffeine, you throw in a dash of sugar. All those things affect how you feel and your overall health, and their effects tend to be very immediate. And then I talk about the long-term sort of intermediate things that they're eating and drugs that they're taking, and point out the similarities that sometimes you may find that if you're not getting enough vitamin A or B or something, you might not feel well, might not have energy. If you're not getting certain metals or carbohydrates, you might notice you're a little drowsy. If you get too much, you might feel a little, overly wired. So everyone's had those experiences with foods. They've also had them with drugs. They know what it feels like when they've been, smoking marijuana every day and how they're a little fuzzier as the week goes on, or when they stop taking their antidepressant, their SSRI. So the way the chemicals affect their brain in a sort of a period of weeks or months is the same sort of pattern they see in the way that the things that they're eating affect how they feel, from day to day as well. And then finally, there are the long-term changes that foods and drugs have on us. For example, we know that men who eat dark chocolate every day tend to live longer than men who don't eat dark chocolate, all things being equal. We also know that people who take statins to lower their blood cholesterol live longer than people who don't. We know that individuals who were smoking marijuana back in the 1960s and 70s today are not getting Alzheimer's at the rate they were. We know that people who smoke cigarettes don't get Parkinson's disease as often as other people. So chemicals in those plants, tobacco, marijuana, coffee, grains and so forth, beans, and also the nutrients that people are eating day to day, they know they're going to affect how they age. And by looking at the epidemiology, we can point things out and say, see how that chemical in that plant that one person calls a drug and another person calls a nutrient have effects on how you age. So by looking at epidemiology and interviewing people and asking them, sir, you're 100 years old and you're not demented. What did you do differently? We're gaining a lot of insight in how chemicals that people view as either drugs or nutrients, and for everyone that definition is a little blurry sometimes, do affect how we age and how our brain changes with aging.
Professor Wenk, if we knew in the mainstream, if we knew just how similar quote unquote drugs and quote unquote food are, because I think in most people's minds there's a very clear dividing line, but as you've said, and if you dig into the neurobiology, that line becomes very blurry very quickly. If we knew on a mass scale how similar drugs and food were, what do you think we would do differently as a society?
Wow, that question is actually quite profound, because the basis of that question is why we have certain drugs today that are legal and certain drugs that are illegal. We have all heard the comparisons between marijuana and alcohol, and I've had a number of students bring this up that, well, look at marijuana is nowhere near as harmful as alcohol in terms of liver function toxicity. And the science, unfortunately, has nothing to do with society's laws. The FDA's view in that particular example is that one chemical, the one from the plant, marijuana, is illegal, whereas alcohol, we know how dangerous it is legal. Their attitude is that once something is out of Pandora's box, you can never put it back in. So if one day we decided that all drugs, chemicals, foods should only be considered on how toxic they are, how helpful they might be, what would change is that we would have to outlaw alcohol and make marijuana legal. We would have to outlaw aspirin because it's so toxic to the gut and has many toxic side effects in the liver. We probably have to outlaw chocolate because it has so many psychoactive ingredients in it. Goofy things like this would start happening when we really recognize the reality of how nutrients that we extract from plants that we eat that affect us in ways that we like versus those that affect us in ways that we just simply enjoy, like alcohol or psychoactive compounds, or affect us in ways that are quite toxic. They're all chemicals. They act in us in ways that are beneficial and harmful depending upon dose and other factors. Well, then you have to realign what we are calling safe and make some things now that are legal and available illegal. Well, you saw what happened in the 20s with prohibition. That didn't work out. We fear now that if you make something legal, take it out of Pandora's box, you can never put it back in. And that's the FDA's viewpoint. Another great example is nicotine. The FDA is well aware that it kills many people. It kills approximately in the U.S. 2,000 people a day. That's the same thing that happened on September 11th when the planes flew into the skyscrapers. Well, no one notices all those deaths because they die individually, one at a time at local hospitals, not on the evening news. So if we recognize that tobacco is dangerous and make it illegal, which any government, any Republican, Democratic Congress could have done, but if we change the rules and drugs and chemicals and nutrients are only judged on their properties, we have to make tobacco illegal. Well, the FDA won't do that because we recognize that it's toxic. We recognize that people are going to die. And if everyone stopped smoking today, we'd have to move back retirement age by another 6 or 7 years immediately. The planned death related to some uses is built into our culture. So it would become a mess. Things would become very complicated for a while, and the consequences financially would be immense as well. The United States makes a lot of money by selling tobacco to the rest of the world. It's one of our major food exports, or chemical exports, you could say. So that would change. I think that's why you've never seen it happen. And I don't think we will see it happen in our lifetime, that we will say, let's base the decision on the fact that all chemicals can be either good or bad, nutritious or not. Let's only judge them on their safety. It would make a mess of things.
Gary, that is profound, and it just got my head spinning. I've been jotting notes down, and you finally gave legs to something that I have not been able to articulate, hopefully up until this point, which hopefully I'll articulate it well, which is people get amped up about, like, we know sugar and just all the profoundly horrible things refined added sugar does to people from a neurological perspective, as well as from just a endocrinological perspective. And then people say, well, it's a slippery slope, because if you start regulating sugar, what are you going to do next? And blah, 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 blah. And I was always like, yeah, that's bad, but it seems like we're already doing that. And the reason I was thinking in those terms is maybe the question is, if we're talking about things that we put in our body, like anything you put in your body causes things to happen. Like if you put it in your body, something happens. And we have artificially classified things you put in your body in different categories. But if we were to just say, is it reasonable to regulate things you put in your body? As a society, we've said yes. And we've then drawn a artificial line between, well, this class of things you put in your body is okay to regulate, and this class of things you put in your body is not. And what is so profound about your research and the research of many other individuals is that as that line becomes blurry, that distinction becomes meaningless. Like if it's in your body and it's causing neurological changes, that's one class of things. I don't care how inconvenient it is. Let's quote Al Gore here. That's the inconvenient truth, and we should probably understand it and live according to it. What do you think?
I think you've actually summarized it beautifully. It's almost consumer beware. And that's really the way we do with most of our over-the-counter drugs. I love to use chocolate as an example because it always surprises people both how beneficial and harmful it can be. After my book came out, I was contacted by a woman who suffers with a relatively rare disorder that just mostly affects women, called chocolate anger, where the aggregate effect, no single compound in chocolate does this, but it's the aggregate effect of all the chemicals in that plant, the cocoa powder, that produces in some vulnerable individuals. So in this case, she needs to beware, an anxiety and anger that in her case has almost gotten her fired a few times. So what she does is simply avoid that chemical. To her, it's a powerful drug that is risking her, her happiness, her job. Whereas for other people, it's a wonderful, joyful experience. So you can see that for one person, powerful chemical, dangerous chemical. For others, very, very different. And as I mentioned before, for men, it is a life-altering drug because you will live longer if you eat more chocolate. It's the same thing with coffee. Coffee, if you drink 5 cups a day, your chances of getting Parkinson's disease go down 85%. I would call that a drug, but most of us never see it that way. So you're right. Every person is going to have to ask themselves, what's the risk of eating or consuming this chemical, be it food or nutrient or drug, whatever we want to call it, whatever name you want to give it, it doesn't matter. What's it going to do to me? And so this is why some of these services where they genotype you and tell you you're going to be sensitive to caffeine or you're not going to be sensitive to caffeine and so forth, you get information. That's the future. We are all probably going to know that chocolate's good for me, chocolate's bad for me. Cigarettes are good for me, they're not. We know that people who smoke cigarettes don't get Parkinson's as often. Let me give you a great way to view cigarettes. Cigarette smoke is one of the most powerful heavy metal chelators that people expose themselves to anywhere in the world. So if you view it that way, you can take a nice deep breath of cigarette smoke and blow off all those awful, toxic, heavy metals. And oh my God, give me another puff of smoke because it's going to make me healthier. That's true, because it does chelate heavy metals. And if you happen to be vulnerable to them, or you work in an environment where there's lots of heavy metals, or you eat them in your diet, you might want to smoke to get them out of your body. But no doctor is ever going to recommend that. But you might decide it's good for you. Or you might decide that wearing a nicotine patch is good for you, because nicotine as a chemical is very neuroprotective. It rescues cells from things that age them and kills them. We know that. We can prove it in test tubes in animals. We can see it in the epidemiology, but no one's going to recommend to you, go out and smoke some cigarettes, unless maybe you need the protection that they're going to offer you. So if you begin to view all chemicals, nutrients as just simple things, molecules that once they're in your body are going to do things you want, things you don't want, you choose, weigh it against your genetics, and then decide what to ingest. That's the future, I think, where we stop labeling things. We just take them for what the value or risks that they have.
Gary, it is truly a transformational paradigm, and it gets back to also another, it seems like, false distinction between there are side effects. Like, there are no such thing as side effects. There's just effects. You put something in your body and things happen, and that's not really even controversial. You can study it in a laboratory setting, and you can say, when I do this, this happens. We understand that. The question, as you've said, is now, are the benefits outweighing the costs of that substance? And it is transformational, because I don't think any parent would give their child something they knew caused neurological damage. But when we have an industry like a food industry, which has absolutely there's no control. And I'm not saying we should come in and regulate everything, but we do not allow the sale of heroin in schools. I think most people would think that that's probably a good thing. If we start to see that there are substances in our grocery store shelves that do things shockingly similar to heroin, and we not only allow but encourage the sale of that in schools, that seems wrong. Maybe I'm missing something, but it seems wrong to me.
I would agree with you, but there's a lovely slippery slope with your example. If we were to outlaw any source of heroin, we would have to ban nursing by all mammals, because one of the things we discovered is that those brain heroin receptors are there so that the very first day a mammal nurses to take mother's milk, in their gut, and in yours and mine as well, milk protein is converted into an opiate-like heroin compound that gets into the brain of a newborn, not in us, because the blood-gut barrier. But if you're 1 day old and you're nursing, you get a whopping dose of heroin, which says to your brain, come back here tomorrow. This nipple is wonderful. That's why it's there. We would never abuse opiate plants, opium, if it weren't for that receptor that evolved in our brains to partly reward us for nursing. So you can see, what are we going to make illegal if we outlaw cows to protect us from their heroin and their udders? Life gets a little weird. So this is the challenge we have, because these chemicals are so pervasive in nature. And why are they pervasive? Because we share an evolutionary history with them on this planet. So there's so many things in plants, in animals, that affect us, that are psychoactive, that affect our health, and either good or bad, that it becomes almost mind-boggling to avoid them or find them in the right balance. But as we learn more about these things, we're going to be able to help educate the general population and say, you know what, this is why when you eat chocolate, you become angry, or when you eat this, you feel better, and so forth. We're getting to that point. We're unpacking the mysteries, but it won't be acceptable. People are not going to listen until they realize that everything you put in your body, as you just stated so beautifully, will affect your body and your brain. And if you keep doing it, your very plastic brain will adjust to it and say, I love sugar. I want sugar tomorrow. I want sugar the next day. Fat's the same way. And chemical companies that are designing flavors are just there responding to our demands. And related to that, last year, it was discovered that we now have on our tongue something we never thought was there, a specific receptor for fat, the taste of fat. We didn't believe that existed. Well, now that we found the receptor, these flavor companies are going to target it. You're going to be able to taste the fat in fake bacon, the fat in fake pastries, unlike you've never tasted them before. So all of a sudden, they're going to have, mayonnaise that's fake, that's going to taste like the real stuff. And it's going to go on and on and on. You can see what's coming in the next year or two. We're going to be blown away by flavors we never thought we could experience on our tongues. So those are just chemicals, but they make us believe that it's fat and it's going to taste creamy and wonderful. That's where we're going. And so if you can't tell that chemicals are nutrients and psychoactive drugs and they're good and bad, now we're going to get a great demonstration during the next year.
Professor Wenk, it is certainly a complicated issue, and I think it is very fair to bring up the slippery slope. And I think it's actually wonderful to look at the slippery slope from both perspectives, because I think we oftentimes, myself included, jump to, we live in America, we're about freedom, and we start to hear about, controlling things and yada, yada, yada. And we say, oh, no, you're taking my freedom away. There's a slippery slope there. The key thing to understand about slippery slope arguments, at least in my experience, is you can always argue them both directions. So yes, there is a slippery slope in terms of regulation, but it seems that we're also experiencing the slippery slope of non-regulation right now. What you just described is amazing, and it is an example of the slippery slope of, if you go and you ask an 8-year-old what they put in their body, it is like that. What they say, what they eat, what they do, the fact that we have 40 million children under the age of 5 worldwide who are overweight, the fact that the incidence of diabetes is now 100,000% more common than it was 100 years ago, seems to suggest that the slippery slope of allowing food corporations to do whatever the hell they want to whoever they want, whenever they want, that is also a slippery slope, and it seems that it's an unsustainable model. What do you think?
I think you're right on. It is unsustainable. We see now that we've gone too far. But the problem is we are a capitalistic society. People will make money by selling you fat, salt, and sugar. And our brain evolved to seek out those 3 things that we abuse the most, because high caloric, sweet things and salty things do not occur easily in nature. So our evolving ancestors didn't bump into them that often. So our brain says, whenever you find fat, salt, and sugar, I want you to eat all of it to completion. And so this is why at smorgasbords and buffets, if we're standing by it, we will even eat food, this has been shown recently, that is putrid and unhealthy looking if we are defending it from others and if it's sweet. So our brains push us to do things our bodies tell us not to all the time. And we see that when you're 8 years old and you can't make that judgment, you just eat what you're fed, and your brain rewards you and says, thank you for the fat, salt, and sugar. Go get more. Because that's what our brain has evolved to do. It has huge survival value, and it sells a lot of products. If you look at the things that we tell young kids to avoid, it's always fat, salt, sugar. They're not out there abusing, high proteins and starches as much, except for maybe French fries. But that is the problem. We have slipped too far in that direction because it makes too many people money. It's the same thing could be said for alcohol and tobacco. It makes a lot of money for the U.S. Economy and for individuals, and we're addicted to it because our brain is addicted to those things, because it's how our brain evolved. Same thing is true for heroin. It just isn't as easy to come by. You don't find heroin in a vending machine, but you can find fat, salt, and sugar easily, and we respond to it using the exact same biological pathways in our brain. So it really, if you view heroin and sugar in the same sentence, you realize that you've got to treat them both with care and caution. But when I published a blog on this, and that Psych Today blog, some of the responses were that that's outrageous. You can't compare sugar to heroin, because people don't want to hear that. Heroin is a dangerous thing used by, bad people, and sugar is something, that is delicious in my, cereal, but they're the same from the brain standpoint.
Well, and Professor Wenk, can I maybe one thing that I found to be somewhat effective, because I get the exact same things, is, for example, if you want to eat sugar cane, like literally chew on a sugar cane, that's probably okay. And when we talk about the point I'm getting to is there's a dose dependency. And when we talk about like heroin and cocaine, we are taking certain substances and concentrating them down into a pharmaceutical form that has a profoundly different effect than if we were to just eat them as they exist in nature. And when you and I talk about sugar, we're not talking about like strawberries are like heroin. We're saying when you take sugar and you concentrate it down into pharmaceutical doses, then yes, it's just like anything else you dose pharmaceutically and isolate. That's what we're talking about. Is that fair?
It is fair, and it is true. We do concentrate them because the idea is that these chemical companies, the drug companies, the flavor companies, they want you to have a very ephemeral but yet profoundly rewarding experience, meaning it hits your tongue, you get a blast of flavor, you've heard the commercials, and then it goes away quickly so that you want another right away. It's, one is never enough. So yes, that's why they concentrate it, to get that very brief but very intense stimulation. Now, the comparison is in chocolate. Back to that again. People enjoy chocolate. Why? Well, one of the ingredients in chocolate is an amphetamine-like compound. Another ingredient in chocolate is a marijuana-like compound, which is why you'd want to make it illegal right away. And we know that people, if you ate enough, it would be a similar experience to, eating marijuana or, doing some crack or something, but no one ever eats enough of it. You can't get enough in your body. You would never eat that much chocolate. The doses are too low. So we tend to be more tempered, more measured in how many pieces of chocolate we eat. But a piece of candy, sugar, or something very salty or very fatty, we'll just keep eating them, like potato chips. My God, that's a beautiful thing, and especially if you throw some chocolate on it or a little sugar coating, like, the popcorn with salt and sugar on it. People just eat that like it is heroin. And so they sell a lot of these kettle corns, for that reason, because it's the perfect blend of fat, salt, and sugar. So, yes, you nailed it. It has been refined so that the oral experience is just supremely perfect, so that you keep going back for more and more.
And Professor Wenk, to empower our listeners because obviously this is shocking and new information for a lot of people, but just to empower our listeners to make the change necessary to enable their lives and the lives of their children to be as vibrant and healthy as possible. It seems that one of the reasons, for example, most parents don't give their children cigarettes is because they understand that smoking cigarettes causes lasting damage. And if you start smoking cigarettes, it becomes harder to stop. So they're addictive and their effects are permanent or close to permanent. Have your studies shown that these edible products display similar characteristics in the sense that it's not just, it's a treat and they're a kid so they can handle it? Is it predisposing them to an addiction, to craving more of it for the rest of their life? And is it leading to or causing damage which is not ephemeral, or effects in the body that are negative and are not ephemeral but are lasting?
The short answer is yes. But there's those caveats. A lot of that data comes from epidemiological studies. The mechanistic connections where you can, connect point A to point B, those are tough to do with human children because you have to wait so long to see the consequences. But we're aware that the brain is very plastic at that age, and an imbalance in nutrients, the presence of certain chemicals, many of them can get in the brain very easily because the blood-brain barrier is not intact. So they are more vulnerable, especially during the first 2 years of life. So we warn, new mothers about that, of certain things, don't give them too much caffeine. It might make them irritable. Don't give them too much, fill in the blank. One of the things that we've noticed as a cause and effect is monosodium glutamate, MSG. That chemical is actually, I use in the lab as a neurotoxin. It's a very selective chemical tool that will kill neurons. And our concern now is that when children eat foods that do tend to contain MSG as a flavor, just as an example, it gets into the brain across the blood-brain barrier, and it does damage feeding neurons in feeding centers. And we see that that does lead to obesity. So that's a one-to-one connection. We don't have many of those. What we have from other studies in terms of additives, colorants, and so forth is that there seem to be indirect evidences that they can produce changes in the behavior of the child over the long term. Sugar is a nice example. The brain can only use sugar for energy. It cannot easily use fats or proteins for energy. So that's why when you wake up in the morning, you want a donut. You want something that has a high glycemic value, like a bagel, or bread like on toast, or sugar in your coffee. There's a reason that all those coffee shops, Dunkin' Donuts and Tim Hortons, are out there. We want them there. Our brain says, go get the sugar. It's the only thing I need right now, since you've been fasting for the past 8 or 10 hours, not eating. So that's why we choose sugar in the morning. It's why children choose it in the morning. It's your brain saying, go get it. I want that particular item. But it's also addicting because it releases endogenous opiates. It releases endogenous marijuana-like compounds and tells your brain, thank you. We really like that. Go get some more. So yes, we are in a way condemning our young children to a life of obesity by giving them these things when the brain is young. It adapts, it is plastic, and it gets used to it. It considers the presence of lots of sugar and fat to be normal. And when that normal is disturbed, it demands more.
Certainly something we should think about, folks, because again, it's not about, obviously food is wonderful and the right kinds of foods are the most glorious thing we can do for our health. But when we start to understand that it's what we put in our body is just information, then that changes things a bit. And it seems like that's why we need to take this seriously. And that's why we need people like Professor Gary Wenk to help do the profound research that, frankly, Dr. Wenk, I think is transformative and so empowering. So I do appreciate all the work you've been doing.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me as a guest.
Professor Wenk, it's been an absolute pleasure. And folks, if you want to learn more about his work, please hop over to Psychology Today. He has a wonderful blog called Your Brain on Food. And again, his name is Dr. Gary Wenk, PhD, and his last name is spelled W-E-N-K. He also has a book called Your Brain on Food, and he is a professor at Ohio State. So that makes him awesome on top of everything.
That's a lot.
Dr. Wenk, it's been a pleasure. And listeners, I hope you enjoyed today's show as much as I did. And please remember, this week and every week after, eat smarter, exercise smarter, and live better. Talk with you soon.
Wait, don't stop listening yet. If you like the podcast and if there's other ways we can help you, please join us in the Smarter Science of Slim support group, which is freely available at the Smarter Science of Slim website, smarterscienceofslim.com. There you'll find all kinds of free recipes and success stories and just all kinds of fun stuff like how to help your kids go sane and just great community content.
And just one last thing before you go, if you wouldn't mind heading over to iTunes and up onto Amazon.com and leaving us a review, and then going over to Facebook and liking us, we would hugely appreciate it.